Mark, what did you think about what the President said today, how he presented himself? Look, Donald Trump is a human Rorschach test, right? And honestly, there are certain words that jump out and they're the only ones that some people will hear, and they're processed in lots of different ways. The people who have hated him are saying, well, as soon as you say troops from the White House while there's protesters and that's authoritarianism, well, then other people would say, after seeing what they have seen, where police officers are now being shot in St. Louis, police officers are being beaten up in New York City, where the violence is roaming all over the place, and the brother of the person at the very heart of all of this has said, please don't do it. They see it as law and order. And that confrontation that ended up with the Australian cameraman today was because that bubble of protection was around him as he was moving. Does it make it right or wrong? No, I'm just trying to explain how it happened. What did you think?
Well, Paul, across the political spectrum, there's one foundational belief in which we should all advocate, and that is that the basis of a good society is stability and the rule of law. There's not a single example in human history of progressing disadvantaged people through chaos and anarchy. There's no example of people getting ahead in life in an environment of lawlessness and violence and looting and the sort of scenes we've seen in the United States. Now, Nick, I suppose, is typical of lefties who take a certain view of Trump. But, someone like Nick would regard Paul Keating as a great man. I regard Paul Keating as a great man of Australian politics, no doubt about it. In 1995, when the logging protesters ring-barked the Australian Parliament, Keating wanted to, this is all documented in Troy Bramston's books and elsewhere, Keating wanted to call in the Australian Army and have our tanks push the logging trucks away to break the blockade. Now, that was a peaceful protest. Nobody died, no one got hurt, no one was punched, no shops were looted. And here's Keating, a strong leader, wanted to get the tanks to push the logging trucks away. So, Trump on that scale is very, very proportionate to what's going on. And perhaps the real question in the United States is these governors who could clear the streets because of the virus, germs in the air, they haven't been able to clear the streets in any effective way when you've got criminals breaking into shops, burning down buildings and all this other anarchy that we're seeing on the TV reports. So, maybe Trump should have called the army in, got his own tanks in to push them away, Keating style. What do you think of that, Nick?
Well, look, I just love the way that I simply pointed out that I thought Donald Trump wasn't handling these awful race riots in a particularly good way, and somehow you've turned it into, I condone violence on the streets and support anarchy. Of course, I support none of those things. I detest violence. I think what's happening on those streets is awful, and I think, of course...
But you blame Trump for them. But you blame Trump.
Civil rule needs... Well, no, I blame Trump because he sees it through his own selfish prism of his re-election. And the guy is deeply imbalanced.
But OK, Nick, what about those who are trying to transfer the conversation to Australia? What do you say to those that, again, literally New Daily, Turnbull Times, Channel 2, we're all out there trying to say, hey, here's the equivalent, here's the equivalent, here's the equivalent. What do you say to those that are going to try to bring this to Australia?
Well, can I start by saying that what Trump's doing may well actually end up being a successful electoral strategy for him. The political cynic in me knows the history on this. So Nixon won the 1968 election by saying that he was going to be stronger than anyone in restoring law and order on the streets in the US after the race riots of that era. So it is actually a proven electoral strategy. In terms of back in Australia, look, I agree with that police officer before who said Australia is not the US. We do have complex race relation issues in Australia, but they are, I think we're Australia and that's the US.
OK, but Channel 10
I do think the incident today in Surrey Hills was quite shocking, though. Like, I've seen the footage, it's awful.
I agree. Telling a police officer you're going to break their effing jaw is terrible.
Well, I mean, there needs to be an investigation into that and we can establish exactly what was said, because I think there is some conjecture over that at the moment, and that's what a proper investigation will do. And of course, the problem with, that police officer, in my humble opinion, overreacted, and the problem with that is it risks undermining community confidence in the broader police force. And I think Australia's got the best police force in the world. There is no country I can think of who I would rate more highly their police officers, and their police, and I think are more trusted than our police are. And so I think New South Wales Police need to absolutely independently investigate that. We need to know the truth so that we can make sure that confidence in our police force continues to remain high.
But isn't it that thing when you talk about the successful electoral strategy? I don't think it's about an electoral strategy that's about scaring people. It's about people see that there are lines that should not be crossed. There should not be a line that is crossed in the way that that the man was originally arrested. Clearly, there's a consequence, which is you go to jail for a degree of murder. Equally, the consequence has to be that you can't just randomly run around streets and start blowing things up or doing whatever you want or taking the white man's stuff. And Rita, if, for whatever reason, it's a tick in his polls or there's some sort of an up in all of this, it's because the American people want that, because they say, look, we want a system that says when a police officer goes too far, they go to jail, but conversely, when somebody destroys my main street, they go to jail too.
Well, obviously, this is not something Trump has engineered. This crime, the death of George Floyd, I'd call it a murder, but wait for the trial. That happened in a Democrat city, in a Democrat state, in probably the most left-leaning parts of America. So to try to pin that on Trump is bizarre. And to try to pin what's been happening in the US for the last week on Trump, I think is equally bizarre, because the states are responsible, the governors and the mayors of those cities, and they have not handled it well. And that's why today he has stepped up and said, you either fix this or I'm going to step in and fix it for you. And he's now being called a dictator for that. The same people who yesterday were criticising him for not doing anything other than just tweeting about the crisis are irate that he's actually now entered the field and said, I'm going to do something about it. And I think it is going to help him in his re-election strategy. He presented himself as a law and order candidate last time around, and circumstances have presented that I think that's going to happen again. And that's not him engineering that. It's not some manipulation. It is just what the situation is. And I just find it extraordinary that people are bending over backwards, try to defend this absolute crazy, violent lawlessness. We've had a number of people killed in these protests, including at least one police officer. Like, how much more death and destruction needs to happen until the president is allowed to act without being called a dictator?